higher accuracy weapons begin to be introduced. Technology sort of marches on and does not wait for negotiations to start or to stop. There is a certain technological momentum. So slowly but surely, and particularly with the development of multiple warheads, MIRVs, that are independently targeted, we develop the capability to strike their weapons. And they are trying hard to develop the same capability.
This nose cone contains MIRVs, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. MIRVs allow one missile to deliver as many as 14 warheads. They're also more accurate than earlier missiles. This accuracy led to another reevaluation of strategy. In mutual assured destruction, cities are targeted. Each society is held hostage by the other. This is called counter-value targeting. It means targeting population centers, threatening to cause as much devastation as possible. A nuclear weapon exploded anywhere in these cities will destroy them. It need not be very accurate. Accuracy, however, is essential to an alternative strategy called counter-force. Here you target your adversary's forces to destroy his ability to continue fighting. MIRVs made counter-force more attractive. One MIRV missile can destroy several opposing missiles, thereby disarming your opponent. In early January of 1974, Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger gave a speech at the Overseas Press Club in Washington. He announced a change in U.S. nuclear strategy toward counterforce.
The change is one that has been discussed in various foreign policy reports of the President. The intent is more effective deterrence of the possibility of strategic warfare, because it is known by all parties that the President of the United States has options other than the devastating option of going against the cities on the other side.
What Schlesinger then says in 1974 is, we need weapons to be able to strike with just limited capability. This in some ways is not a very new idea. It really is an extension of flexible response, but it is an extension that is incorporating the reality that we now have very advanced, very accurate weapons. We are building MIRV weapons. We have hundreds and then thousands of them. We need a rationale. Why do we need so many weapons? The answer Schlesinger provides. We need weapons to strike limited targets in a very selective fashion. And the sort of political and psychological argument is, unless we have that very finely tuned capability, we won't be able to deter finely tuned attacks.
Soviet strategy, since the mid-60s at least, and actually going back to the late 50s, is based on preemption. The notion that if it looks like war is about to occur, the best strategy for employing one's forces are to destroy the enemy forces before they can be used. That is, you target your nuclear forces first on the enemy nuclear forces, because that plays a major role in limiting damage to yourself. And then you also have forces that are set aside to target cities and industry. So it is counter-force targeting. That's exactly what preemption is.
Negotiations had continued while both sides were developing a counter-force capability. President Carter and Chairman Brezhnev signed the Second SALT Agreement in 1979. In return for higher ceilings on some U.S. systems, the Soviets were allowed to have more large land-based missiles. American critics charged that the U.S. was negotiating itself into inferiority. SALT II became the focus of strong opposition. Prominent among the lobbying groups that opposed the treaty was the Committee on the Present Danger, made up of many former government officials. One of its founders was Eugene Rostow.
It was like the race of the tortoise and the hare. We were ahead. We were far ahead in the nuclear weapon, and then we went to sleep under a tree. The Soviet Union kept moving along, putting tremendous resources of science and technology and money into the development of nuclear weapons. And then suddenly, finally, we woke up and discovered that the tortoise had outstripped us.
The critics saw the accuracy of Soviet missiles increasing. They argued that the Soviets were out to get a first strike capability that would knock out the U.S. deterrent force.
By threatening to make a first strike against our ground-based missiles, our submarines in port, our planes on the ground, they think they could make the rest of our nuclear arsenal irrelevant, prevent any response, and thus coerce us politically.
Others argued that even if this were the Soviet intention, to actually be able to launch a first strike successfully is highly unlikely. Professor Costa Tsipas.
I think for physical reasons, because of the unpredictable behavior of the missile and because of the reliability of the missile, because of the operational difficulty of orchestrating such a large attack, I think such an attack will never really succeed to the point that it would be worth it, launching it. To attack 1,000 silos with 2,000 warheads is a highly complex operation where you have warheads from different missiles attacking the same silo, and you must time them right, and they must all come in waves that start out of south and they move north, and things like that. So the probability that all this is going to happen exactly as planned, even though it depends on human operators that have never really practiced this, is quite small. Most probably what's going to happen is going to be massive confusion. Some of the missiles will go off, some will not go off. We see what happens with NASA quite often. I mean, they want to launch a single missile and they have to stop once in a while. Now, you can't do that if you're trying to have a nuclear attack against another country. You just push the button and you wonder what happens. Sometimes the button will be pushed and the missile will go, and sometimes it will not.
I don't think the central problem is whether the Soviet Union would actually undertake a preemptive first strike. The real problem is, I think, that the existence of a Soviet capacity to take a first strike would have a profound, and is having a profound effect on Western political attitudes.
The Carter White House, wary of losing the balance of power, gave the go-ahead for the new MX missile system.
The system is survivable, it's verifiable, it has a minimum impact on the environment, it's affordable in cost, and it's consistent with our SALT goal of deep reductions in strategic arms.
The MX is essentially as much a political response as a military response. He's saying we need a kind of shot in the arm, if you'll pardon the metaphor, to show that we're still competing with the Russians, that we're able to build large and effective missiles just as they are.
Originally, the MX was to be hidden in an elaborate underground maze to make it more survivable. In authorizing the MX, the Carter administration moved U.S. nuclear strategy further toward counterforce.
MX is sort of a premier counterforce weapon. It has large numbers of warheads on a relatively small number of missiles. The warheads are very accurate. They can attack Soviet missile silos. Therefore, it's very much designed to be a counterforce weapon. And from the perspective of the U.S. Air Force, it's desirable because their job is, if war comes, to be able to destroy the enemy and to be able to destroy the enemy's forces. And they want the most capable weapons they can have at their disposal. The MX provides them such a capability, even though it makes other defense strategists and other politicians very nervous.
It's basically a first strike weapon which threatens the Soviet deterrent and thereby provides them with very strong incentives for launching a first strike to try and destroy our MX before we get it off the ground. In other words, we'd be in a situation where both sides have a strong first punch, and the guy who gets in the first punch is the guy who gets off the better.
President Carter authorized 2 other new missiles. This one, the Pershing II, is meant to have pinpoint accuracy. From Europe, it can reach targets in the Soviet Union in 5 minutes. The Pershing was scheduled for deployment with NATO forces because the Soviets had deployed their SS-20 missiles, aiming them at Western Europe. The cruise missile is relatively cheap to build. Twice as long and half as heavy as the Hiroshima bomb, it is 10 times more powerful. It can be launched from the air, sea, or ground. It can travel hundreds of miles, guiding itself with uncanny accuracy. But because it is also so easy to hide, it is extremely difficult to verify in any arms control agreements.
Now we're moving into a place where we have a new generation of weapons, Pershing missiles in Europe, cruise missiles in Europe, and the MX and other very accurate long-range missiles based in the United States. Now these new weapons, in my view, do not improve our security. because they are not deterrent weapons. What they are is weapons which are only useful if you use them first. And in fact, they provide incentives for initiating a nuclear war rather than for deterring a nuclear war.
The newly elected Reagan administration didn't see the new missiles as destabilizing. They were concerned about the U.S. falling behind.
Our deployed nuclear forces were built before the age of microcircuits. It's not right to ask our young men and women in uniform to maintain and operate such antiques.
The effectiveness of our deterrent has been eroding because of the modernization that the Soviets have put into their system, and the fact that we have not. And we now have systems that are not too vulnerable to first strikes by the Soviets, and it is essential that we rebuild them as quickly as we can.
The Pentagon's modernization program demanded the largest increase in the defense budget since the massive U.S. buildup in the mid-60s. According to newspaper reports, the buildup supported a new nuclear strategy, one in which the object is not simply to deter, but, as a Pentagon document says, to prevail. The strategy would incorporate a new generation of weapons. The MX, 100 have been authorized by Congress. The Trident submarine, carrying 24 missiles with a total of 336 warheads. For the first time, a submarine-launched missile had been designed to have the accuracy of a land-based ICBM. The B-1 bomber, canceled by the Carter administration, but then revived. The supersonic B-1 was scheduled to replace the B-52 in the American nuclear triad. The military use of space has also been given high priority. A network of satellites is necessary to maintain the command systems that coordinate U.S. nuclear forces around the world. The strategy supported by these weapons envisions controlled, limited nuclear strikes against military targets. These strikes might continue, in the language of the Defense Department, through a protracted period and afterward. It would be war as it had always been, only this time using nuclear weapons. Buried inside the solid rock of Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado is the North American Air Defense Command, NORAD. It directs the facilities that communicate with and control U.S. nuclear forces around the world. To be able to fight protracted nuclear war, NORAD must keep functioning even if hydrogen bombs are going off. One effect of nuclear weapons, however, especially when detonated at high altitudes, is to create a powerful surge of energy known as EMP, electromagnetic pulse. As this pulse surges through electronic equipment, transistor circuits, computers, radar, it sets up currents so strong that the equipment can burn out.
In that case, the ability to fight a war, which means to have some kind of control over the actions of your forces, disappears. Therefore, you don't have a war, you just have, groups of people with missiles at their command who do not know what the leadership of the country wants, and some of them may be very conservative and never launch, some of them may say, well, the last thing we have to do is to launch these warheads, and you have a totally chaotic situation.
NORAD is trying to develop systems that won't be affected by EMP and other effects of nuclear weapons. The largest single increase in the new defense budget is for making the U.S. command, control, and communications facilities more secure.
Do you need to be able to fight effectively a nuclear war in order to deter it? Or if you begin to develop that capability, does it increase the likelihood of actually fighting a nuclear war? This is sort of the conundrum that policymakers are in. Some people, many individuals in the Reagan administration, believe that the more capability you have to fight a nuclear war of all sorts, of all types, of a limited nature and so forth, the greater you strengthen the deterrent. Whereas others feel equally passionately that if you develop all those capabilities, and the Russians do too, then you're marching down the path toward fighting nuclear war.
We certainly don't plan to fight limited nuclear wars. We would, however, I think this makes good sense, like to be in a position, if a nuclear war should occur, we would like to be in a position to see that the minimum number of weapons are used and that the war is terminated as quickly as possible.
One of the difficulties about preparing to fight limited nuclear wars is that it probably makes it easier to make the decision to use nuclear weapons in the first place. You plan to use these nuclear weapons rather than to just have them there as a deterrent.
This is the Arbit district of downtown Moscow, home of the Soviet Institute for the Study of the USA and Canada. The few Soviet government specialists who speak with the Western press work here. Former General Mikhail Milstein.
We don't accept any concept of the limited nuclear war. We strongly believe if so-called limited war starts, it immediately will escalate into a nuclear holocaust.
For the areas where the limited nuclear war will be carried on, it will be not limited. It will be a total catastrophe. Say if there is a limited nuclear war in Europe, for Europe it will be the end of European civilization.
The Soviet strategy for intercontinental nuclear warfare has always been the use of the entire nuclear force against the full array of targets, military targets, political targets, economic targets, and there's never been really any variance from that at all. In terms of limited nuclear war having to do with Europe, that's a very different question. There is evidence that Soviet military leadership does subscribe to some notion of limited regional nuclear war when it explicitly excludes any attacks on the homeland of the Soviet Union.
Europe is considered the most likely place for nuclear war to start, since so many opposing military forces are concentrated there. Also, NATO's policy is to use nuclear weapons if it's losing a conventional attack. Military exercises have been conducted to try to determine what might happen in such a case. Participating in such war games when he was deputy director of the CIA, Dr. Scoville.
There would be aggression by the Red Team, and they would be using conventional forces, and the Blue Team wasn't doing very well. So the Blue Team would say, well, we've got to convince these Reds that we're serious, and we'll drop one nuclear weapon on one of their tank battalions and wipe it out, and that'll scare them off, and then we'll have ended this war. And that was the jumping the fire break to using nuclear weapons. But the problem was that it didn't end the war. And in the two cases where I fought this kind of a mock battle, the end result was there was not only no Europe left when we got through, there wasn't any United States or Soviet Union as societies as we know them today.
Whatever we may think now, if a nuclear weapon is ever used, the world will discover, however suddenly, that it has an enormous interest in constraining that use of nuclear forces.
Europeans began protesting the planned deployment of American Pershing and cruise missiles and the Soviet SS-20s. Although their governments urged the deployment, the demonstrators feared that Europe would become the battleground of the two superpowers. Opposition increased in the U.S. as well. Prominent were scientists and doctors who used the fact of the devastating effects of nuclear weapons to argue for a freeze on further weapons development. Dr. Jack Geiger.
There is no way of being ahead anymore. The United States and the Soviet Union are like two men standing in a basement up to their waist in gasoline. One of them's got 9 matches and the other's got 10 matches. And it's absurd to say that one is ahead of the other or safe.
The freeze became a grassroots concern. New England town meetings began to debate the issue in early 1982.
Request the President of the United States to propose to the Soviet Union a mutual freeze on the testing, production, and deployment of nuclear weapons and missiles and new aircraft designed...
The freeze was meant to cut through the time-consuming process of official negotiations. The demonstrators didn't want new formulas for replacing or modifying weapons. They wanted to stop the arms race altogether and cut back. At the commencement ceremonies of his alma mater, President Reagan announced that his administration was finally opening negotiations with the Soviets.
For the immediate future, I'm asking my start. And start really means we've given up on SALT. Start means strategic arms reduction talks. And that negotiating team to propose to their Soviet counterparts a practical, phased reduction plan. The focus of our efforts will be to reduce significantly the most destabilizing systems, the ballistic missiles, the number of warheads they carry, and their overall destructive potential.
The START talks began in Geneva in 1982. But after a year, neither these meetings nor the negotiations over missiles based in Europe had achieved any visible progress. In Moscow, Vitaly Zhurkin.
I personally don't see any anything positive there. I see an attempt, first of all, to decrease, to limit and decrease only those systems of strategic weapons where the Soviet Union is stronger. Keeping outside of the limits of the agreements those systems like SLBMs, like cruise missiles, like bombers, some others, in which the United States are stronger.
The Soviets felt the U.S. was using the talks to get ahead. The U.S. argued the Soviets were using the talks to stay ahead. But even with decades of mistrust and new weapons development, negotiations remain an integral part of nuclear strategy.
The record shows, in my opinion, that the Soviet Union is serious about nuclear arms control. And I think the reason that they are serious is the reason why we can trust them in this regard. You can trust anybody to act in their own self-interest. It is in the national self-interest of the Soviet Union to prevent nuclear war. They recognized they could not survive a nuclear war.
I would trust them a lot more if I had good information as to what they were actually doing. One thing we've learned in the arms control context in the past is that the Soviets will exploit loopholes and uncertainties in agreements that have been concluded, and they will exploit them sometimes with some very unpleasant surprises.
There is no need to trust them. I would not trust them. Why should anybody else trust them? But I don't have to trust them. I'm perfectly willing to sit down and negotiate with them as long as any kind of agreement we end up with is verifiable by national technical means of verification, namely by satellites or other means that do not have any kind of subjective kind of component in it. I don't have to trust you if I can see what you're doing all the time.
First of all, we're not lovers, neither the United States nor the Soviet Union. Even lovers don't trust each other, you know. Well, at least they have to be a little bit suspicious. But speaking seriously, well, it comes, first of all, through talks, through negotiations, through verification. It comes through coming to an agreement, a real agreement, which based on two principles which were accepted by four American administration, parity and equal security. And if all these things are fulfilled, I mean, going to life, then the trust will come somehow.
The general thrust of administration policy has been to propose to the Soviets reductions in forces, strategic forces, and theater nuclear forces that would have the effect of reducing the threat that we perceive emanating from the Soviet Union, and would perhaps, one doesn't really know quite what they think, reduce the threat that they may perceive coming from the United States. And that situation is a much more stable one than the one we have now.
Today, both sides face each other with huge arsenals and with strategies and weapons that may make war and accident more likely.
But in April 1947, the United States had 0 ready atomic weapons. And now we have some 25, 30,000. The Russians have some 15, 25,000, adding up maybe to 50,000 total or more. This extraordinary increase, 50,000, each one Hiroshima-like, so to speak, many of them much larger, only a few smaller, is a new phenomenon in our day. We don't really know how to understand it. That's the trouble. The diplomats and the military have felt, well, it's always easier to get more than fewer. It's always safer and surer and stronger appearing. Let's get more. That was the way it was in the past. They've not understood that this is now a great danger, a mutual danger in which both superpowers live. They are each able to destroy the other and themselves by initiating this effect. And I think there's no security in the long run except reducing the number very, very sharply.
If we are making errors, they are on the side of caution, and we are saying, let us make sure we have that little extra rather than not have enough. The irony of this, of course, is that if the Russians in fact feel the same way, it propels a tremendous amount of momentum to our competition. And we just keep each saying to each other, we better be safe than sorry, and we keep building, and maybe one day we'll make a mistake with catastrophic consequences.
If the goal of strategy is to ensure the security of a nation, a successful strategy in the nuclear age remains elusive and uncertain. But there is no uncertainty about the effect of the weapons both sides have. If the strategy of deterrence fails, it could release the most destructive arsenals ever assembled. In World War II, the total destructive force expended by all the warring nations amounted to roughly 3 megatons. A megaton is the destructive force equal to 1 million tons of TNT. From 1939 to 1945, about 3 million tons of TNT were exploded. 3 megatons. Today's nuclear arsenal is equal to almost 15,000 megatons, nearly 5,000 World War IIs, ready to be unleashed at a moment's notice. If this arsenal were made up of only Hiroshima-sized bombs, and if one bomb were dropped every 3 seconds another Hiroshima, the nuclear rain would fall for 40 days and 40 nights without end.